Welcome everyone, Christine here with the discussion about Retribution and Protection Paladins for World of Warcraft The Burning Crusade Classic. How these two specs were underestimated and underutilized by the community on retail for pretty much the entirety of the expansion, though things did get better later on with the Sunwell Plateau, and people did realize some of their potential but not fully, and where these specs will stand once Classic comes out. What will they have to offer to raid teams in Classic? In general, when we look back at retail, early on, guilds pretty much brought the vanilla roster to raids for much of the early part of TBC, and it only really started changing with Zolaman, then with Sunwell Plateau, when raids were forced to adapt to the challenge that Sunwell Plateau brought. Sunwell Plateau is where you get a lot of the min-max raiding culture. That's where it really was created, where theory crafting became far more important, and where you really had to optimize your raid team in order to be able to clear the content. But even then, these specs were underestimated as well as others. I mean, if you look back at TBC, it's not just Retribution and Protection Paladins, it's Balance Druids, it's CPS Shamans who are underestimated for a large portion of TBC on retail, especially Elemental Shamans, and then the DPS potential of Hunters and Warlocks was also vastly underestimated. There were plenty of Warlocks who didn't want to play Destruction because they didn't think it was worth it, because they thought Affliction would do more damage, and plenty of people thought that as well. Same with Hunters going Beast Mastery. It took time though, but people did realize with Hunters, with Warlocks, that they were useful. But for the most part, early on in TBC, it was a vanilla raid roster that was brought forward into TBC. The only notable exceptions were with Shadow Priests being used, two Shadow Priests being used because of their high damage and return mana, and to an extent Feral Druids, though not quite fully becoming the very powerful main tanks as we would later know them in Sunwell Plateau in particular. Though Sunwell Plateau was a significant change in general for the game, for Feral Druids it made them the best tanks in the game because crushing blows were eliminated in Sunwell Plateau, so Feral Druids who had high HP, high armor, had far better survivability than either Warriors or Paladins, and guilds didn't really use that many Protection Paladins to begin with. You have to understand that for Retribution and Protection Paladins, it wasn't just a case of, oh, these specs are weaker than others. No, it's the idea that persisted for pretty much the entirety of the Burning Crusade in some cases, with only some exceptions on AoE tanking for Protection Paladins, but the idea persisted that these specs were completely awful, that you didn't even want to bring them to a raid. You didn't want a Retribution Paladin in your raid, you didn't want a Protection Paladin in your raid either, for the most part. Though some adjustment did happen for Protection Paladins because of their AoE tanking potential. Part of the problem, beyond the fact that guilds had a vanilla roster and were not keen on changing it, part of the problem was that holy paladins were very powerful. The attitude towards paladins in general was that, well, if you want to raid, you have to be holy. And guilds would refuse to allow you to play holy. I mean, it happened to me, it happened to plenty of other people. I personally leveled as protection once I got to max level in the guild that I had played in up until that point, and I wanted to join for Chaos, and I was told either go holy or you're getting kicked. That's just, that was the attitude. For many, many people across the board during retail World of Warcraft for both Retribution and Protection Paladins. Holy was very powerful. It was a very mana-efficient tank healer, or a single target healer in general, and you would benefit quite a bit from bringing 2 or even 3 Holy Paladins to your raid. I think 3 was the standard for a lot of guilds, and the reason is they were very mana-efficient, they were very powerful, they could keep a tank up or keep plenty of people up, actually, with their single target heals during the course of the Burning Crusade. And having 3 paladins is ideal because of the blessings: Blessing of Kings, Salvation, and then Might or Wisdom. You could have all of that for most people. Not everyone. I mean, hunters can get Kings, Might, Wisdom, and Salve, but for most part, 3 paladins was enough to get very close to optimal blessings, and then having 3 different judgments. Though Holy Paladins keeping judgments up on a target was always iffy, so to speak. Eventually things did change, but it was a very, very, very slow change, and certainly didn't happen overnight. In some cases, it never really happened at all. For Retribution Paladins, only a handful of guilds really accepted them as part of their ranks. The issue for Retribution is that they were a melee DPS. Well, we have plenty of those coming from vanilla into TBC, and we actually need to shrink our rosters, so that was part of the problem. On top of that, Holy was very strong. Retribution wasn't very strong. Retribution obviously required blacksmithing to be very powerful, required a good amount of gear, raid gear, to do any kind of decent damage. And I mean, if you have a reputation of being a bad DPSer, chances are raiding guilds are not going to give you the gear that is required for you to be able to do any kind of decent damage. I mean, an example I can give that would apply for a lot of people, DST. DST is the best trinket for any physical DPSer, including Retribution Paladins, but DST was also very, very rare. Guilds could raid for well over a year, only see a handful of them, if not only just one. There are some pretty bad stories. I mean, similar with how Warglaives were, or trinkets in general, certain weapons were very difficult to acquire, and certain pieces of gear were very difficult to acquire. But without those, certain DPSers were not able to do the damage that they could achieve. They couldn't achieve the highest level of DPS that their class could put out. Another problem for Retribution Paladins was the faction balance. The fact that Horde didn't particularly like Paladins, whereas Alliance had plenty of them, and it was really Alliance Paladins that were generally writing a lot of the guides, doing quite a bit of the theory crafting as it existed back then. It certainly isn't. The theory crafting that we had back then isn't nowhere near the levels of theory crafting we have in the game today. That's worth saying. But the fact that you had Alliance Paladins doing the theory crafting, and yet Blood Elves, because of Seal of Blood, were able to do a lot more damage. The reason Seal of Blood is able to get to Retribution Paladin to do more damage isn't just the fact that Seal of Blood in itself is more consistent damage, it's also the fact that it damages you. So when you get healed, thanks to Spiritual Attunement, you get mana back, which is very important since Retribution Paladins do have severe mana issues. On top of that, you could seal swap between Seal of Command and Seal of Blood to achieve much higher damage, something Alliance Paladins couldn't really do. I mean, yeah, they could seal swap between Command and Seal of Righteousness, but it's not nowhere near the same amount of DPS. And all of these factors combined led to a situation where people didn't really understand what Retribution Paladins could do, their full damage potential. Eventually, people did realize the Seal of Blood was useful, and some Retribution Paladins on the Horde side did take advantage of that to be able to do decent numbers, but it was a very long road, and very few guilds were willing to accept Retribution Paladins as part of their core raiding team. Where will they stand in Classic? Well, they do have a 2% damage aura. They do have 3% crit for all DPSers via Improved Judgment of Crusader, though Protection Paladin can also do that. But very importantly, you will not want to have more than one Holy Paladin as part of your raiding team. You could, and many guilds did do this back on retail, but in Classic, you won't need them. But you still want those free blessings, so that's where Retribution comes in. It fits into that slot. And on top of that, the most important thing actually from Retribution Paladins, on top of the fact that they'll do significantly higher damage since the Fury Crafting has improved by quite a large amount, and hopefully Blizzard does give them Seal of Blood, even for Alliance Paladins. But the most important thing is actually Judgment of Wisdom. Yes, Protection and Holy Paladins can judge Wisdom, but they can't keep it up. If a Protection Paladin is tanking, he's going to want to judge Crusader anyway. So it really is something that comes down to the Retribution Paladin to ensure it stays up on a boss, because a Holy Paladin is going to have issues keeping 100% uptime, and Wisdom is very important. It's important for pretty much every DPSer that has a mana bar, including Feral Druids, if they're trying to do any kind of decent damage. It matters for Shadow Priests, it matters for Balanced Druids, it matters for Warlocks who have to tap less. It matters especially for Hunters. Hunters have the potential in will have the potential in Classic to be the highest single target DPS, but without Judgment of Wisdom, they won't do as much DPS as they could because they'll run out of mana. So they'll have to change their aspect. They'll have to use potions, mana potions. They'll have to use more dark runes than they'd want. And so they might even have to make a trinket change. So they won't be able to do the same kind of DPS that they'd want if they don't have Wisdom up on a boss. And it's only really a Retribution Paladin who refreshes all the judgments on the target, be it Crusader, Light, or Wisdom, through Crusader Strike, that is going to be able to keep it up. That is an enormous advantage, and one that people don't really realize until they've played with a Protection Paladin and then played without one. It is hard to find one, actually. It's actually going to be hard to find one. The spec isn't that great. The gearing is very expensive and very annoying in parts. And on top of that, you're never really going to be able to do the damage that other people are going to be able to do. And although you can do some decent damage, especially on undead and demons, thanks to exorcism, you have an annoying rotation to pull off. Because you have to CL swap to do any kind of decent damage, and it's not fun. From my perspective, it's just not really all that fun to play a Retribution Paladin, but it's certainly gonna be very important for a raiding team, if only because of wisdom and having that for a blessing. It's going to be very important from that perspective. As for Protection Paladins, well, they suffered quite a bit because of one simple fact that has existed since World of Warcraft was launched, that joining a guild as a tank is a very difficult proposal at the best of times. Finding any good raiding guild as a tank is just a challenge in of itself. Now imagine playing a tank that pretty much everyone thinks is horrible. And when I say horrible, I'm not saying that, well, we don't want to bring them in a raid, or if we bring them to a raid, we'll have them AoE tank. No, we don't think Protection Paladins can tank a 5-man normal. We don't think Protection Paladins can tank a heroic. And certainly we don't think Protection Paladins have any place as part of a raiding team in Karazhan, let alone things like SSC and Tempest Keep. And that certainly was the attitude for an enormous number of people on retail. It didn't help when Nihilum gave an interview basically trash-talking the spec as well as other specs and saying guilds that use Protection Paladins and Balance Druids will do worse than the guilds that don't. That was something that Awake, one of the officers in Nihilum, said in an interview, and it had a major impact because obviously a lot of people do follow what the top guilds do. It was only much, much later, and only for the sake of AoE tanking on bosses on like Muru or Morgrim or the Hydral Trash, that Protection Paladins found a raid spot. But even then, they were only used for tanking trash, and generally it was just a guy who had either a holy main spec that would respec for those particular bosses to fill that role. Guilds didn't necessarily, many guilds, a vast majority of guilds didn't necessarily have a dedicated Protection Paladin, certainly not on the top level. A few guilds did have Protection Paladins that would main tank, really, would tank bosses like Brutalis, Illidan, and so on. But for the most part, you rarely saw them. Very, very few players actually were able to achieve that. And it was an uphill climb for a lot of us that did play a Protection Paladin, just because of the attitude, and just because finding a spot in a guild as a tank is difficult in itself. Guilds had established tanks. Guilds had established tanks that had proven themselves in vanilla and didn't really want to change them. I mean, it was a similar issue for Feral Druids, but Feral Druids just fit a very nice niche in a raiding team that Protection Paladins never could, really, because Feral Druids could tank and then can swap to DPS and do pretty decent damage. And that's what they're going to do once Classic comes out. Protection Paladins were in a situation where initially people didn't think it was worth bringing them in the raid at all. Then there was, to a degree, the niche of AoE tank, and even then it's like, oh, well, you're never going to tank a boss. And that's where it ended. And it was a struggle convincing people of even that. Every boss, every trash pack, every dungeon, every raid was a discussion. That's how it was on retail. People really underestimated the class. Now, part of the problem was certainly gameplay-wise, but really it was the attitude more so than anything else. Gameplay-wise, however, Protection Paladins had far less survivability and even threat than, say, a warrior tank, because the baseline stats. But on top of that, as a Protection Paladin, you would want to get the crush cap. Why is that? Because survivability always matters as a tank in the crush cap. Even if you're not tanking a boss, is important for a Paladin tank because avoiding or blocking every hit that comes your way, even from trash, is going to significantly reduce the damage you take. So, Protection Paladins ended up with less survivability, less threat because of that, though. Because of baseline strats, and because the initial gearing that they had to go for, which included getting a lot of block rating, also diminished their survivability and their threat. Though, honestly, as a Protection Paladin on retail, threat was never really a major concern until I started entering Tier 6. And even then, once I got full Tier 6, it was not a big issue. Threat was not a big issue. It's going to be an issue in Classic. That's going to be a different discussion. And Warriors do have a baseline advantage because they do have higher baseline survivability. They can get crush immune just by using shield block. And on top of that, they do have base threat due to Sunder Armor, which is baked into Devastate. So that is a pretty significant advantage that Warriors have early on. And Paladins are the weakest of the tanks in Burning Crusade. They will be the weakest of the tanks in early Burning Crusade. Only really useful for the sake of AoE tanking on certain bosses. It wouldn't surprise me at all once TBC Classic comes out that guilds that are going to get the world first on Kael and Vash are just going to do so with a team of warriors, no druid, no paladin. Because druids and paladins both need gear to be viable. Here's the thing though, and this is where Protection Paladins will really stand once TBC Classic comes out. Once you get the gear, you scale very, very well with it. This happened on retail, especially after the release of Zul'Aman and a 10% stamina buff that Protection Paladins got as part of their talents, courtesy of a change by Blizzard. What happened is Protection Paladins end up scaling very well with raid gear. So initially in blue gear and pre-raid gear, you're going to be the weakest of the tanks, but then you start getting raid gear, especially if it's 2.1 itemization, but even with 2.0, you get much more powerful. And with tier 6, well, with tier 6, you have a lot of fret, you have spell damage on the gear, all the spell damage that you need. Maybe you need to change some trinkets if you really want to min-max your fret, but for the most part, you have gear that has very high spell damage, high armor, high avoidance, and you're going to be pretty much on par in those areas with a warrior. And you're going to do a lot of fret and have a good amount of survivability. And similar with druids, like druids also have this situation where they start out weak and get far stronger. So that's where Protection Paladins are going to be. They're going to start weak and they're going to get a lot stronger. And they're going to be instrumental for any guild that's going to seek to do speedruns, that's going to seek to do very efficient raid clears, that's going to want to go into the raid and pull as many packs of mobs as they possibly can and AoE everything down. That's something only a Protection Paladin can offer. And I'm sure there's some crazy stunts people will be able to pull off in Classic, like, I know, solo tanking Hydros as a Protection Paladin, that could be very useful. Or two Protection Paladins tanking Hydros, that could potentially work out as well. Bosses like Carafres, Morgrim, all that. Protection Paladins will be very useful, and they will be instrumental in efficient raid clearing once Classic comes out. This was not really understood back on retail, except only a few guilds, and certainly not the very best guilds. Just in general, tanks are difficult to replace because a lot of tanks are raid leaders, guild leaders, officers, so it's always difficult to find a spot. It's always difficult to make a replacement for a tank. Anyway, Questine here on Serious Gaming signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.